Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. I begin in the name of Allah, the Compassionate, the Merciful. I would like to welcome you to the introductory episode of the Original Nation Report. I am your host, Muhammad Al-Hashimi. I am currently an adjunct professor at Euclid University at www.euclid, which is euclid.int. Additionally, I am an associate scholar at the Center for World Indigenous Studies at www.cwis.org. To begin with, there is a verse in the Holy Quran that continues to inspire me in my work advocating for the rights of self-determination for the more than 5,000 indigenous nations in the world today. Nations such as the Oromo Nation in Ethiopia, the Uyghur Nation in China, the Krenak Nation in Brazil, the Lakota Nation in America, and most profoundly at the present juncture in world events, the Palestinian nation, suffering under the yoke of the brutal genocidal regime of the apartheid state of Israel. This verse is found in Surah Al-Hujurat, Ayah 13, which can also be identified as the 13th verse of chapter 49 in the Holy Quran. The original Arabic text can be rendered into the English meaning taken from Towards Understanding the Quran by Sayyid Maududi as follows, and I quote, "Human beings, we created you all from a male and a female and made you into nations and tribes so that you may know one another. Verily, the noblest of you in the sight of Allah is the most pious of you. Surely Allah is all-knowing, all-aware." Now, the meaning of this verse can be summarized by saying that the creation of humankind goes back to the original pair, or to an original pair. Then over time, from that original pair proliferated and evolved several descent branches, all having lineal connection to the original pair, and at the same time having developed into several human communities that have distinct languages, geographical homelands, and distinct lineal and ancestral identifications. These and other attributes contribute or define the concepts of nation and tribe, the tribe being the subdivision of the nation. The only superiority of any nation or tribe over another nation or tribe is based on moral excellence and righteousness. Now, this verse 13 of the chapter 49 of the Holy Quran discusses the origin of the nations with its tribal subdivisions. I will refer to it as the original nation verse. One important inference that can be drawn from the original nation verse is that all humankind in existence today has a connection to at least one original nation, whether present and known or buried in the past and unknown. For example, some of us know that we are Oromo, the largest original nation in the Ethiopian state. The language of the Oromo people is properly called Afan Oromo. Others of us have lost that original nation connection due to the evil machinations of war, enslavement, imperialism, colonialism, and cultural and linguistic erasure, which severed us ancestrally from knowledge of our original nation identity. Now, in the world today, there are some 5,000 nations spread across the world. According to the International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs, based in Copenhagen, Denmark, the population of these nations collectively is at least 476 million people in at least 90 of the 193 states in the world. The states being the 193 countries of the world, countries like Canada, Russia, or Brazil. A state is different from a nation. The confusion comes into play because the word nation is often used interchangeably with the word state. For example, you hear people talking about the Ethiopian nation or the Eritrean nation. In reality, both are states, where the Ethiopian state consists of more than 80 nations, and the Eritrean state is said to consist of 9 nations. Many of these indigenous nations are found wholly inside the political boundary of the state. Other nations are split up into parts by the political boundaries of states. For example, the territory of the Afar nation of Northeast Africa is split up between 3 states: Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Djibouti. Most of the Afar homeland is geographically located in the boundaries of the Ethiopian state. Another example is the Oromo Nation, the largest indigenous nation in Northeast Africa. While most of the Oromo homeland is geographically located within the political boundaries of the current Ethiopian state, the historical core of the Oromo homeland is located in southern Ethiopia and northern Kenya, thus creating a 2-state divide for the Oromo homeland. Now, these situations can be a source of tension for many reasons, especially where members of the nation see themselves solely as a member of their nation and do not recognize the different state structures that have divided the geography of their nation. The Afar and Oromo nations are only 2 of the more than 80 indigenous nations in Ethiopia, according to the International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs. What I have found particularly interesting in my research of indigeneity in Ethiopia is how the current Constitution of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia pays special attention to the rights of the indigenous nations and their peoples within its state borders. It is as if the framers of the current Ethiopian Constitution, originally promulgated in 1995, were sensitive to particular and profound historical geopolitical tensions between Ethiopia's 80-plus original nations on the one hand, and the process involved in the formation of the Ethiopian state on the other. A formation with its current boundaries that began in the middle of the 19th century. It is clear from several articles in the Ethiopian Constitution that there is an explicit recognition of indigeneity among Ethiopia's people. This recognition can be seen in several articles in the Constitution, including Articles 5, 8, and 39. To begin with, under Article 5, Section 1, it is written, and I quote, "All Ethiopian languages shall enjoy equal state recognition," end of quote. This, of course, implies that there are multiple indigenous languages above and beyond Amharic, the official language of the Ethiopian state. Now, in Article 8, Section 1, it is written that, and I quote, "All sovereign power resides in the nations, nationalities, and peoples of Ethiopia," end of quote. This is a clear statement that Ethiopia is composed of indigenous nations. Now, in Article 39, sections 1 through 5, under the title Rights of Nations, Nationalities, and Peoples, it has been established that Ethiopia is composed of previously independent indigenous peoples that have, under the Ethiopian Constitution, the right of secession from Ethiopia. The 5 sections reads as follows, and I quote now. Section 1. Every nation, nationality, and people in Ethiopia has an unconditional right to self-determination, including the right to secession. Section 2. Every nation, nationality, and people in Ethiopia has the right to speak, to write, and develop its own language, to express, to develop, and to promote its culture, and to preserve its history. Section 3. Every nation, nationality, and people in Ethiopia has the right to a full measure of self-government, which includes the right to establish institutions of government in the territory that it inhabits and to equitable representation in state and federal governments. Section 4. The right to self-determination, including secession of every nation, nationality, and people shall come into effect when a demand for secession has been approved by a 2/3 majority of the members of the Legislative Council of the nation, nationality, or people concerned. When b, the federal government has organized a referendum which must take place within 3 years from the time it received the concerned council's decision for secession. When c, the demand for a secession is supported by a majority vote in the referendum. When d, the federal government will have transferred its powers to the Council of the Nation, nationality, or people who has voted to secede. And e, when the division of the assets is effected in a manner prescribed by law. Now, Section 5 says the following. A nation, nationality, or people for the purpose of this Constitution is a group of people who have or share a large measure or share in large measure a common culture or related identities, common psychological makeup, and who inhabit an identifiable, predominantly contiguous territory. End of quotation of Article 39. Pretty long article, but it's very important to have gone over that. So what we have in a seemingly progressive constitution is an Ethiopian state recognition of the equality of all indigenous languages. B, the state recognition that these indigenous nations have sovereign power. And C, the state recognition that these nations have the right to self-determination up to and including secession from the Ethiopian state according to the process laid out in Article 39, sections 4A through E that I went over earlier. It should be noted, however, that according to the International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs, that, quote, to date, there has not been enacted any national legislation that recognizes and protects the rights of indigenous peoples beyond the 1995 Constitution. In other words, little has been done to fully actualize the rights of original nation peoples in the Ethiopian state beyond the lofty words of the Ethiopian Constitution. Nevertheless, I find the text of the Ethiopian Constitution quite awesome. Believe me, you will not find anything this progressive in the American Constitution relating to the more than 500 indigenous nations within the borders of the American state. In fact, you can go back to the American Declaration of Independence from the British Empire, promulgated on the 4th of July, 1776, 13 years before the American Constitution was written, and promulgated in 1789 to find the racist attitude of the founders of the American state towards the peoples of the indigenous nations they found. They defined these indigenous peoples collectively as savages, right there in the language of the Declaration itself. This racist attitude clearly indicates white settlers from the European states who crossed the Atlantic Ocean to settle in the fledgling American state felt absolutely no qualms about participating in the massacre and genocide of indigenous peoples in order to confiscate their lands and expand the American state from the Atlantic to the Pacific Oceans. It is my intention in a future episode of the Original Nation Report to discuss the historical geopolitical interaction between the American state and the indigenous nations, which were fully brutalized by the expansion of the American state. Now, returning to the Ethiopian Constitution, it should be noted that Article 39, previously quoted, is the most controversial article with regard to the Ethiopian Constitution. There are those who basically say that the Constitution has to be rewritten to remove this article because it invites the dismemberment of the Ethiopian state. Others say that this would be a tremendous political mistake, citing the need to continue to work to rectify serious historical geopolitical tensions that were clearly in the thinking of the framers of the current Constitution. It is my intention to discuss in more detail these historical geopolitical tensions in a future episode of the Original Nation Report. At this point, I want to talk a bit more about the distinction between a nation and a state. I have been careful to use the two terms nation and state as distinct terms. This is because, from the technical point of view, these words have different meanings. As I have already clearly mentioned, a nation refers to a community of people united by common descent, language, and geographical homeland. An identifiable original nation also has a distinct history, culture, and original religion. Furthermore, where peoples of an original nation have not forcibly been relocated, they can be found in their original contiguous geographical area. Dr. Hiroshi Fukurai, an original nation scholar as well as a professor of legal studies and sociology at the University of California, Santa Cruz, offers the following contrast between the nation and the state from his book, co-authored with Richard Cruth, titled Original Nation Approaches to International Law, The Quest for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the Nature in the Age of Anthropocene, published in 2021. Dr. Fukurai says, and I quote, "The term nation refers to the culture-bound territory of a common people, as well as the people themselves. A nation is a cultural territory made up of an organic community of unconstrained, self-identifying individuals who are sufficiently conscious of their common ancestral values of history, tradition, ideology, language, religion, and memory, and who possess shared psychological bonds that are strongly attached to the historical, interconnected, culture-bound territory and space. Now, Dr. Fukurai goes on and says the following about the state. He says, the state is distinctly different from the nation. The birth of the state involves the dense history of colonialism, imperialism, projected upon the multiplicity of non-consenting nations across the globe. Unlike in the nation, there is little shared thread of cultural, historical, and traditional commonality in the state to bind together the resulting multiplicity of nations and peoples. As a result, the state is by definition a legal construction, a legal fiction in which people are coercively held together by a forced network of legal mechanisms and authoritarian institutions bound in the imaginative collective community of the state. End of quote. Therefore, based on Dr. Fukurai's observations just quoted, we can see that a state only has to be a political entity with a defined territory, a recognized border, a permanent population, however varied in its cultural makeup, and a government capable of exercising effective control over its people, and also able to engage in relations with other states. A nation has an existence going back thousands of years into deep antiquity, whereas the concept of the modern state did not come into existence until the 17th century as a result of something known as the Treaty of Westphalia. Inshallah, if God wills, I will go into more detail about the Treaty of Westphalia as the catalyst that led to the creation of the modern state system in a future presentation. For now, just keep in mind what defines a nation, especially its claim of common ancestral connection for all of its members. A state generally cannot make this claim. We can also say that a nation is a natural creation initiated by the creator of the heavens and the earth, whereas the modern state is a man-made construct devised less than 400 years ago under the auspices of the European Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. Now, the point of confusion between the words nation and state is that they are often used interchangeably, as if they mean the same thing. For example, you hear people talking about the American nation when they really mean the American state. Then again, we have the international body known as the United Nations. But in reality, the 193 members of the United Nations are states, not nations. Again, the 193 members of the United Nations are states, not nations. As I have already pointed out, there are some 5,000 original nations in the world today. They are also referred to as indigenous peoples or indigenous nations. They can also be referred to as ethnic groups. It is important to discuss original nations for several reasons. First of all, in many cases, they suffer tremendous oppression from the state apparatus. Secondly, in the extant territories that original nations still inhabit, there are often abundant resources coveted by the state in collaboration with multinational organizations. Thirdly, the territories of many of our original nations are the lands of great biodiversity that is being threatened by outside forces. Maintaining biodiversity is one of the important keys in mitigating the impact of climate change. My approach here at the Original Nation Report will be geopolitical, in advocacy of the sovereignty and self-determination of the original nation. This advocacy comes mainly from my recognition that the original nation is a creation of Allah, as indicated in the original nation verse, and it comes in part from my hostility to oppression and denial of human rights. There is a paradigm or methodology of research that fits the nature of my proclivities, known as the original nation approach to international law, or simply ONEL. A paradigm primarily developed by Dr. Hiroshi Fukurai, whom I have already mentioned. ONEL, more precisely defined, is original nation scholarship that puts the nation, not the state, as you will usually find, at the center of the geopolitical analysis of domestic global affairs. A fundamentally different interpretation from the state-centered perspective in geopolitics. A critical narrative of history, geography, politics, identity, citizenship, gender dynamics, human and non-human relations, as well as of the role and efficacy of domestic international law. That brings us to some concluding remarks. This is just about it for this introductory episode of the Original Nation Report. But there's an important thought I would like to leave you with. One of the most important reasons why the plight of the 5,000 original nations is studied in the first place is because of the centrality that original nations hold in the discussion of climate change. No doubt the most profound existential crisis of our times. I hope to show how important the geopolitical state versus nation discussion is to this crisis in a future presentation. I would like to thank you for the privilege of your time in watching this presentation. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. That is to say, may the peace and mercy and blessings of Allah be with you.